you have to make sure that you're doing no harm. That's absolute paramount. This is about the future of children in the Sudbury area, into the future. If you allow 400 parts per million lead in the soil, you are compromising their future. That's a fact. The science tells me that's a fact. The health risk assessment says 40% of the kids at levels of 335 parts per million are going to have lead levels over 5. 40% in Falconbridge, 60% in Coppercliff. Do you want that for your child? That's the decision making that has to take place. Now, a little bit of history of Baldoon and the contamination that was discovered there. In August of 2003, there was a proposal to build a toxic waste incinerator in Baldoon, not just a bit south of the lead smelter. And when the health risk assessment, there was a health risk assessment done for the toxic waste incinerator, the health risk assessment assumed that there was no contamination in the area. And that came to our attention when we read the health risk assessment and said, this isn't right. Because of course it's been a lead smelter there for almost 40 years. So we requested from the province, the Department of Environment, a copy of any monitoring. We didn't know what existed, but any monitoring that the company had done in the area. And as it turned out, what came back to us is 2 inches of data, monitoring that dated back to 1972. We didn't realize that the company, Noranda, which became Falconbridge, is now Xstrata. So Noranda had been doing monitoring of soil, vegetables, gardens, seafood for over 30 years, and nobody had ever seen the data. And we took a look at it, and when I plotted the data in terms of where these high levels were in relation to the smelter and residential properties, they were over the limit. They were considerably, in some case, over 140 parts per million. They were in the range of 2,000. The people who had given permission for the company to sample their properties had never seen the results. So we took this public in August and wrote to the Minister of Environment and said, we've looked at the data, there's a problem in Baldoon, you need to do a health assessment and you need to do more sampling to figure out how extensive the lead, arsenic, and cadmium contamination is in the community. The minister wrote back in October to say, well, most of the contamination is on Noranda property. So there's no need to do a health study, there's no need to do any more sampling. In the meantime, we decided that we would do our own sampling. And I began by sampling all the public properties, the schoolyards, the playgrounds, the ball fields, any public and recreational area in the Baldoon area. And what I found is the school, which was 6 kilometers west, had 1,700 parts per million of lead on the schoolyard. I immediately brought this to the attention of the Department of Environment, the Department of Health. They didn't believe me. So they went and hired a consultant to do their own tests. They tested the schoolyards, and sure enough, the lead levels were high. They ordered a cleanup. In the meantime, I've developed a relationship with the community, and I've gotten some of the residents to allow me to sample their properties. And I'd done the sampling of their properties and found lead levels to be extremely high. I brought that to the attention of the government. And while I'm doing the private properties, I go back to the school where the cleanup takes place and I sample the soil. Well, the arsenic levels are over the limit. So they had used dirty fill to clean up the schoolyard. So finally, there was a second cleanup, a much more extensive cleanup, and that property has now been cleaned up. So in December of 2003, when we present the results of our private property sampling, the Minister of Health comes out and says, we're going to do a community health study in Baldoon, and we're going to do a risk assessment study. In 2005, the results of that study just a little under 2 years and $1 million later, the community health study comes out. Yes, the residents of Baldoon have higher mortality rates, they have higher cancer rates, they have higher disease rates than the health region in which they occupy, as well as the entire province. And the minister declares that there's no link between these high disease, cancer, and mortality rates and the high emissions from the smelter, the historic high emissions, and their high levels of lead, arsenic, and cadmium on people's property. There's no link. But don't eat the vegetables. You've got, well, actually he doesn't say that. He says you have to wash the vegetables before you eat them. And he orders more testing. He orders more blood testing. He orders more testing of seafood, more garden testing, and more property testing. In 2006, those test results come in. And those test results say, well, yes, the soil is contaminated. Yes, the vegetables have levels of lead that are 10 times higher than those in Fredericton. But there's no national standard for lead in lettuce, so they're not over any limits, but it's safe to eat it. Even though that the lead levels are higher in lettuces and strawberries and beets than they are in Fredericton. And the shellfish the Department of Fisheries and Ocean declares a closed area. Shellfish harvesting is no longer allowed. So that's 2006. In November, we asked the minister to immediately issue Xstrata with a cleanup order, that they're required to clean up all properties that are over 140 parts per million. Xstrata responds in November by announcing they're going to do a study. They're going to test the soil. So this is now the 4th or 5th or 6th soil sampling that takes place in Baldoon, and the residents by now are, the standing joke among the residents is, if we get enough testing done, they're going to take away all our contaminated soil and there won't be a need for a cleanup. So November, the Xstrata announces a $1 million soil study and a risk assessment. In June of last year, Xstrata comes out with its results. They recommend that properties with lead levels over 500 have to be cleaned up. They clean up 24 properties, but the province has yet to accept this recommendation of the consultants. So that's a little bit of history of where we are right now in Baldoon with respect to the health risk assessment. The minister has yet to make a decision as to whether they're going to accept the 500 parts per million cleanup level. We have made interventions to the province, and we have asked that we've indicated that this is far too high, and to explain to us why it is that Sudbury, the consultants have recommended that the cleanup level is 400. And in Port Colborne, it might even be lower than that. Why, if these studies have very similar methodologies, why is Baldoon, which is a lead smelting community, that's a no-brainer, you're going to have high lead levels, why are Baldoon residents required to live in a contaminated environment of 500 parts per million? The health effects of metals vary. What we do know a lot about, there's no question about what the health effects of lead are, particularly on children. The number of studies done on lead and their impacts on human health would fill a school gymnasium. Every year, and you can look in the literature and do a search on any of the scientific search engines, there's at least 100, if not 200 studies done a year looking at the health effects of lead. So we know a lot about this, and we know a lot about how it affects children. So there's cognitive, behavior, developmental, all metals cross the placental barrier.